Okay, so in this video we're looking at 1.3 isotose. And isotose is just simply the mnemonic that I use for the different research methods that you might use if you are conducting a study. The isotose, each letter stands for one of the different methods that you might use. The idea is that a lot of people get very nervous around selecting which method and when they're conducting research, so the idea, is use the isotose so you won't have cold feet. Okay, so let's get started. The objectives are really just so that you are confident in being able to describe the different methods, and also you're able to tell me what the advantages and the disadvantages are. So you might want to just keep this in your notes, maybe 3 columns, one for each of those categories. However you want to organize it is fine, but you want to be able to tell me those things and explain those things. Also, if you were to be asked how you would select a particular method for a particular area of topic, you want to be able to do that as well. So just keep in mind those are some of the goals, these are the other objectives, and that's really what you want to be able to do at the end of the video. So I will talk to you about that in the future. All right, so let's get started. Here again are the isotose, the different methods, and you can see in some cases I broke them down further into subcategories. The experiment, the first E, you can see I have another mnemonic next to it called hide dice. The experimental method is more complex than the others and has a higher standard of accuracy, and so as a result there's a whole nother mnemonic you'll have to learn. But we'll do that in the future. We'll look at that later, so we won't spend too much time on that right now. All right, let's get started with the I. The I is for the interview method. Interviews are great for when you know someone has experienced the psychological phenomenon that you're interested in studying. So you can use the interview method, if you were trying to study or collect data on anxiety related to the first day of high school. Obviously, you can grab anybody who's experienced that and conduct an interview with them. So it gives you the ability to ask sort of clarifying or follow-up questions. If you have some stock questions that you're asking, but you notice that somebody is anxious or somebody is sighing, you might be able to ask, well, why did you react that way? And that allows you to collect deeper data and greater information than you would from other research methods. So you can assess the qualitative aspects of people's responses. It's also easy to really account for proper ethics with this because you have the person right in front of you. They're already sitting down relaxed to go over things with you, so it's easy to sort of discuss with them the ethical guidelines for your study and to make sure that they're comfortable with them. The disadvantages are really logistical. You have to meet with each individual, generally privately, generally in a quiet setting. And it can be difficult to get a large number of participants that can find the time and that you can find the time as the experimenter to do all of that. So you're going to need a relatively small target population for the interview method. Research bias can sometimes be difficult to account for here as well. Both the experimenter might record things that are based on their biases with greater emphasis. Plus, if the person is not fully comfortable, the subject may end up giving you somewhat of a skewed view of their experiences. There's also what's called ex post facto interviews, and that means after the fact. And what you would do for those is if there was a case where there was definitely some physical or mental harm taking place, you would want to interview these people after the fact. So obviously, if you're doing a study on the impacts of, sort of abuse on an individual later in life, you're not going to create a study where you abuse a bunch of people and then find out what happens. You're going to do an ex post facto interview where you find people who have already experienced that trauma and then you use them as part of your interview subjects. So that's what ex post facto means. It's a good way to study things that are topics that are based on physical and mental harm. Okay, so the C stands for case studies. Case studies are when you really focus on one individual and you study them incredibly intensely. So you find out everything that you possibly can about that individual, their lives. You might even look at their physiology and their genes. You're definitely going to look at their life experiences in great depth. You're going to get a lot of information about how they see themselves and their personality. Um, Oftentimes when we think of people who are in therapy, in a way, they're almost a case study for that psychologist as they try to work with them to develop, um, coping skills or ways to deal with some of the issues in their lives. But case studies as a research method are usually based on individuals who have exhibited some rather abnormal behavior or maladaptive behavior. And because it is so far outside the norm or so problematic, the researcher wants to spend a lot of time really delving into exactly what has taken place here. The advantages to this are that this method can actually yield some cause and effect relationships, but only for this one individual. It can't be projected out, and that's really important to note. So if you find something in a case and you then find some similar happenings with another individual, you're probably not necessarily going to be able to directly apply that, although it might actually work out that the cause is the same for that second individual. It does provide an excellent depth of knowledge of the case, which is valuable to you. You get a lot of insights when you have a great depth of knowledge. And it's also useful in developing profiles. Psychological profiles are used by law enforcement, FBI, when they're tracking serial killers and things like that, as a way of trying to narrow down the number of suspects that you might have. Disadvantages here are obviously that it's time consuming. If you're spending this much time on this one case, you can't study anything else. So it is potentially problematic. There's only so many hours in the day and in the year and in your profession to really sort of study things. And so this can be very time consuming and sometimes it's not appealing. Also, one of the reasons it's not appealing is because it's limited in that application to the general population that I mentioned before. So, just because I'm bald doesn't mean that if I say that I'm bald and anxious, doesn't mean that all bald people are going to be anxious. So it doesn't mean that I can project out very broadly. I know that's a terrible example, but it's an example. Okay, next up is the experiment. Like I said, the experimental method is much more complex, and we're going to cover it in greater depth later. What I'll say for now is just what's sort of written on the screen. This allows you to try to isolate a variable and to see whether or not that variable is actually causing a specific behavior to be exhibited. And so this is kind of the last stage of research. This is after you've done surveys and after you've done interviews and after you've done case studies and you really feel like you've identified the specific cause of a behavior. And at that point, you might be interested in trying to set up and design an experiment. Experiments do allow for that cause and effect relationship that can then be projected to the general population. So it's a huge advantage in that sense. And also it's an advantage in that it allows for the isolation of just one variable to be studied. Disadvantage, though, is that it's really difficult to account for all of the possible independent variables that can come into play and that can conflict with the results of your study. And so it's problematic in that sense. Time of day that you're talking to a person or working with a person could be a factor in the end results of a study. How they're feeling in their moods. All those kinds of things are very difficult to account for in an experiment with any kind of social psych topic in mind. Because it's so specific, it may end up having somewhat of a limited application. And there's lots of places for research bias to also creep in, which we've covered a little bit, but we'll cover in greater depth as we talk about this in class. All right, next up are tests. Tests are when you set up some kind of performance that you're going to ask an individual to